Pastor Ed here with Daily Devotions for Friday, April the 5th, 2024. We're kind of coming to the end of looking at last week's gospel reading, or actually the additional verses, because as I've indicated throughout this week, there was and also in my sermon on Sunday, there was a shorter ending added on after verse the 8, and then there was a longer ending that continued actually with verse numbers 9 through 20. The consensus seems to be, as I think I've shared more than once, that that shorter ending just doesn't fit. It's just kind of a general bland summation. It's found in only a handful of manuscripts, and so most scholars see that as obviously being a later edition. Most, however, again, do believe that Mark's gospel ended at the end with verse 8. But even those who agree that it ended with verse 8, there's some discussion to this day about whether this was intentional or unintentional. Those who would argue that it's intentional, and this is kind of where I went with my sermon on Sunday, that the story that Mark has told now becomes the story of his followers, and has been the story of the followers, now becomes the story of the readers. So it ends kind of just open-ended, jarringly even. And so what are we going to do about it? I pose that question. It depends on us how the story ends. And some of them even link it back, as I did, and that wasn't original to me, but to the beginning, that Mark's gospel seems to end as abruptly as it began. Again, if you think about it, the beginning of Mark's gospel, there's no birth story, there's no angels coming to Mary and Joseph and so forth. It's just the beginning of Jesus's ministry. Nobody knew where he came from, where he's going, and so just boom, he's on the scene. The story starts, and then it ends abruptly, and that seems to be consistent. There's some scholars who would argue that Mark doesn't go any further than verse 8 because he chooses not to have a description of the resurrected Jesus because, number one, the original intended readers already knew the traditions of those appearances, and Mark kind of just brings it to a close because at that point, there was still this anticipation. He wanted to kind of leave it open-ended, the anticipation of Jesus' second coming, which, of course, many thought would happen in their lifetimes and didn't. Unintentional arguments have to do with the fact that that final verse 8, is strange because it finishes with the word gar, or for, and it just originally it's grammatically it's somewhat unusual. So there are some scholars who would say that Mark never intended to end it so abruptly, that either planned another ending that was never written, or the original ending has been lost. And in fact, that was kind of in the first part of the 20th century in particular, that was a common belief that there's the original ending that somehow has been lost. But then that brings us to the longer ending. So we've kind of dismissed the shorter ending. We've said that most scholars believe that it ended with verse 8. Whether he intended it that way or didn't intend, was there a lost ending? We will never know. But the longer ending, again, most scholars would agree that they were not part, those verses 9 through 20 were not part of the original text of the gospel. There's some stylistic things. It seems stylistically in the words and so forth different. Also, the story, again, seems, even if you don't end at verse 8, then to jump into verse 9, it's rather abrupt. It goes from they were afraid to now after he rose. And there's also the fact that it seems to introduce Mary Magdalene, which is more consistent with the other Gospels than certainly Mark's Gospel. And then there's also the idea that in verses 9 through 20, in verse 9, it says that you have the active tense, he rose, as opposed to the passive construction, he has been raised, in verse 6. So there's some inconsistency there that scholars point out to. But then that addition, was it the longer ending created deliberately, again, intentionally to finish off the gospel? Or did it begin perhaps as what some scholars would say, a freestanding text that just kind of got tacked on? So, was it written with the intent of being the ending, or was it this other freestanding verses that then were just added to the end of Mark's gospel to try to bring some completion to it, the whole thing that I've been talking about all week about having the story end? And then there's what they call the intertextuality, this borrowing from some of the other gospels. And as I pointed out earlier this week, that some of those scenes in verses 9 through 20 are reminiscent of Matthew and of Luke and of John. But then you even have a scholar who says that that perhaps there was, an original ending, and it's Matthew, Luke, and John that have borrowed from this original lost ending of Mark that they added to their gospels. All of which is to say, we just don't know. It's interesting to study it and to get into it the way that scholars do, far beyond my abilities. I've forgotten more Greek than I ever learned, if that's possible. But it's interesting. It's kind of like, I remember studying it in seminary. You're kind of like a linguistic detective. But it also is a reminder to us that the Bible, for all of its divine inspiration, is a very human document as well. That there were writers and editors and scribes who copied it laboriously, as I talked about the other day. And so there were inadvertent and in some cases intentional changes because somebody thought it sounded better if they included something else here and there. The amazing thing is that despite all this, think about the four Gospels and just with the fact of the Easter story. For all their differences, there is so much that's the same. There is so much consistency, despite the relative inconsistency, I guess, which is remarkable, which says to me, not only is this true, but this is also the message that we have to share. Again, any number of witnesses of the same event are going to describe it differently, and it's no different in the Gospels. The fact that they all describe it as happening, even though their descriptions are a little bit different, goes to its truth and probability, and that's the Easter story. And I like the fact that Mark ends so abruptly, and it kind of shifts it to us now. What are we going to do? As I suggested, some scholars have pointed out, as I suggested in my sermon, what are we going to do now? How are we going to become part of that story? And that kind of is going to lead us into, although we have one more day of daily devotion, is going to kind of lead us into this coming Sunday when we go shift to the book of Acts and Jesus's pronouncement that his disciples will be his witnesses. That's the point now after the resurrection and the ascension and the birth of the church. What are you going to do now? What comes next? We'll talk about that on Sunday, but we'll talk one more day tomorrow about all of this. Until then, hope you have a great day, and I'll try to wrap this all up in some kind of coherent fashion tomorrow on Saturday. Until then, take care. Bye.